There is a restlessness within you, one that lingers beneath the surface of your everyday life. You cannot name it exactly, yet you feel its presence. A subtle pressure in your chest, a weight that no amount of sleep relieves, a silent erosion of your spirit. And no, this is not mere stress, nor is it the clinical anxiety you may suspect. It is something far more insidious. It is the psychological residue of having tolerated too much for too long, of lowering your gaze in the presence of what disturbed you until you forgot how to look life in the eye. And the tragedy is that you were conditioned to believe this erosion of self was normal. You were taught that compliance was goodness, that patience was virtue, that swallowing your voice would eventually bring peace. But it did not. Instead, you became a receptacle for the unresolved shadows of others, a vessel for emotional debris they refused to process. You became an unconscious host for behaviors that slowly dismantled your self-worth. And now, when discomfort rises within you, you question its legitimacy. You wonder, am I overreacting? Have I become too sensitive? No, you are not too sensitive. You are awakening. What you are feeling is not fragility. It is the intuition of a soul begging to be defended. Carl Jung saw this long before the world had words for it. In the depth of his psychoanalytic explorations, he uncovered a chilling truth, that it is not always catastrophic traumas that destroy the psyche, but the small, quiet betrayals we endure daily, the subtle manipulations, the masked cruelty, the repeated invalidations that we absorb as if they were our fault. Jung taught that what we do not confront remains active within us, and what remains repressed festers. It becomes disease not only of the body, but of the spirit. This message is not meant to comfort you, it is meant to wake you, because what you have normalized may in fact be the slow death of your authentic self. This article exposes 7 deeply corrosive behaviors that Jung identified not because they offend some moral code, but because they pose a direct threat to the integrity of the soul. These are not the monsters of mythology. They wear familiar faces. They come cloaked in friendship, love, concern, even laughter. And that is what makes them so dangerous. If you do not name them, you will accept them. And what is accepted in silence becomes repeated. Every repetition steals a part of you. You are here, not by chance, and not for entertainment. You are here because something within you has grown weary of pretending. You are here because your soul remembers the sound of its own name and is calling you to reclaim it. Yes, some of these behaviors have been inflicted upon you, but others you have unknowingly repeated, not because you are cruel, but because no one taught you otherwise. And that is the cycle Jung sought to reveal. We suffer what we have not yet healed, and we repeat what remains unconscious. But today, we illuminate. Today, you will not just identify these behaviors in others, but see the subtle ways they live in you. You will understand that self-betrayal is not weakness, it is unawareness, and that awakening, though painful, is liberation. Are you ready to look without flinching? Because once you see clearly, you cannot return to blindness. And though this truth may sting, it will also free you. For to see is to reclaim your inner authority, and from that place no one, not even your own past, can diminish who you are becoming. There are wounds that never bleed, yet they leave scars so deep they reshape your very identity. They begin quietly, almost imperceptibly. A soft suggestion, a subtle dismissal, a gesture cloaked in concern. I'm only saying this because I care. You're overreacting. If you truly loved me, you'd understand. These are not weapons forged in violence. They are words disguised in velvet, carrying the poison of control. And if you're not paying attention, you won't recognize the invasion. You'll confuse manipulation with care, domination with devotion. You'll start to shrink, not all at once, but slowly. First, you doubt the moment. Then you doubt your memory. Eventually, you doubt your very perception. And that, Carl Jung warned us, is the quiet birth of psychological possession. Not by a demon, but by another person's unclaimed shadow. Jung spoke of the most dangerous forces not as external monsters, but as subtle energies that slip through unguarded moments and take residence in our psyche. This is the insidious nature of covert emotional manipulation. It arrives not with a whip, but with a whisper, not with chains, but with emotional promises you're too afraid to break. The manipulator doesn't force obedience. They dissolve your center until you no longer know where they end and you begin. And because it often comes from someone you love, a partner, a parent, a friend, it becomes all the more corrosive. You confuse loyalty with endurance. You mistake suffering for maturity. You call your silence peace, when in truth, it is the sound of your soul being muted. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, Jung wrote, to avoid facing their own soul, and manipulation thrives in that very avoidance. Instead of confronting their own chaos, some will shape you into an image that quiets their anxiety, and if you allow it, they will keep molding you until your reflection no longer belongs to you. You were not born to be the emotional container for someone else's unconscious. But when you've been conditioned to please, when you've inherited a script of survival, you don't fight. You adapt, you tolerate, you absorb. And every time you stay silent to preserve connection, you abandon the very self that longs to be protected. The danger isn't just that they'll cross a line, it's that you'll forget a line ever existed. And by then, it isn't just your boundaries that have been erased, it's your sense of self. So when you hear those familiar phrases, when concern feels like control, when affection starts to suffocate, remember, love never asks you to disappear. And the moment you feel yourself fading, that is the moment to awaken. When domination of your mind no longer satisfies them, they turn outward, to the crowd, to the circle, to the stage of your life, where their need for power takes a darker shape, humiliation disguised as humor. This is the second mask of manipulation, and it is more corrosive than the first, for it is wrapped in laughter. They don't hurl insults directly. Instead, they cast barbed phrases into the air, seemingly light, fleeting, coated with smiles. But every word lands like a dagger wrapped in velvet. It was just a joke, they say, but you feel the sting. And yet, you laugh too, not because it's funny, but because your silence would be punished. Because you know the script. If you show hurt, you'll be accused of being too sensitive, of not knowing how to take a joke, of making everything about yourself. You are caught between two betrayals, your voice or your image. Either way, something sacred is sacrificed. Carl Jung warned us that the unconscious does not distinguish between play and reality. The psyche absorbs it all. Every time someone makes you the object of mockery and you pretend it's harmless, a fracture forms in your self-worth. These jokes are not innocent. They are rituals of symbolic degradation, ways of placing you beneath the speaker, of subtly assigning you the role of the fool, the fragile one, the odd one out. It is a power game cloaked in lightness, and the laughter of others becomes the soundtrack to your erosion. The damage is not always visible, but inside, the inner child flinches, the soul recoils. And who are the ones who play this cruel game? Often they are not the strong, but the deeply insecure. People who cannot face the silence of their own emptiness use humor to mask their fear. They attack to avoid being seen. They diminish others because their shadow whispers, they are nothing without dominance. Jung understood that those who cannot meet their own shadow will project it onto those closest. And if you permit yourself to be the mirror for their disowned pain, you become the sacrifice at the altar of their self-avoidance. You were not born to carry the weight of someone else's unhealed wounds. You are not the vessel for another's unresolved darkness. And if you remain silent, if you pretend their laughter doesn't pierce you, you make a quiet pact with humiliation. You tell your unconscious, this is okay, and the unconscious believes it. That is the true danger. What begins as a joke becomes your identity, and what should have been stopped becomes a doorway through which deeper violations may soon pass. Because once someone has learned they can mock you without consequence, the next violation is even more insidious. It is no longer about laughter, but about distortion. A quiet, psychological unraveling begins, one that doesn't shout, but whispers. relentlessly. They begin to sow doubt not only about what you heard, but about what you are. This is the silent threshold of gaslighting. The moment the psyche is slowly led away from its own ground. It begins with phrases that feel like echoes in a fog. That never happened. You're imagining things. You're overreacting. And so begins a psychological dismemberment, not through violence, but through dismissal. Carl Jung understood this inner fracture intimately. He called it the betrayal of the self. The precise moment when your inner compass, once intact, begins to spin, when the mind, desperate to preserve connection, surrenders its truth in exchange for belonging. You begin to doubt your memory, your emotions, your instincts. You begin to apologize for feelings that were never wrong, and over time, you no longer know where your truth ends and their fiction begins. Gaslighting is not a storm, it is a slow eclipse. It doesn't arrive with force, but with repetition. And the danger lies not only in what they say, but in what you begin to say to yourself. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I did exaggerate. Maybe I did make it all up. This is not self-reflection. It is psychic colonization. You are no longer living in your own inner world, but in a carefully constructed illusion that serves someone else's control. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But the path to that self is often obscured when another person distorts your reflection until you can no longer recognize who is speaking inside your mind." The psychological damage of gaslighting is not loud, it is subtle, subterranean, and enduring. You become the jailer and the jailed, and the worst part is, you don't even realize the prison has no walls, only self-doubt. The moment you begin to doubt your own inner voice, you are no longer free. That voice, your intuition, your knowing, was never meant to be silenced, and when it is, your spirit begins to dim. Gaslighting is not just manipulation, it is soul erosion. But the first step toward reclaiming yourself is not shouting back, it is remembering. Remembering what you felt, what you saw, what you know, and giving yourself permission to trust that truth again. And here lies the most insidious cruelty of all. Once confusion has taken root within you, once your perception of reality has been sufficiently fractured, they weaponize what remains: your vulnerability. This is the fourth unacceptable behavior: systematic emotional invalidation, a slow erosion of your inner voice, carried out not with violence, but with indifference, sarcasm, and dismissal. You speak your truth, and they brush it aside. You open a wound, and they scoff. "You're always so dramatic, it's not that serious. Why do you make everything so complicated?" Behind these phrases is a cold undertone. Your emotions are too much, too inconvenient, too alive. Carl Jung warned that when we repress what we truly feel, it does not vanish, it festers. What we repress, he said, does not disappear, it rots. Every time your experience is dismissed, your soul receives the message that its truth is unwelcome. And so you begin to edit yourself. You tone down your grief. You shrink your joy. You silence your anger. Not to heal, but to avoid disturbing those who prefer your compliance over your authenticity. You become a shadow of yourself, living cautiously, trying not to offend, not to take up space, not to feel too much. But your psyche was not designed to be polite. It was born to be whole. When your emotions are treated as burdens, you internalize a dangerous lie: that your inner world is invalid. And from that lie blooms an entire architecture of self-abandonment. Chronic anxiety, sleepless nights, sudden outbursts of rage, or a sadness that wears no name but lives deep in your bones. These are not flaws, they are signals, symbols of something sacred in you that has been exiled for too long. Jung saw emotion not as weakness, but as the royal road to individuation. To invalidate someone's feeling is to sever them from their instinctual truth. And yet, emotional invalidation often hides behind good manners, light humor, or a facade of rationality. But make no mistake, it is a psychic violence. And every time you silence yourself to avoid being too much, you betray your soul's language. The self begins to retreat, quietly, until one day you don't recognize the voice inside you as your own. To tolerate this behavior is to give your power away, piece by piece, until the only version of you left is the one sculpted by someone else's comfort. But your truth was never meant to be palatable. It was meant to be yours. But the spiral does not end in words or arguments. It descends further into the quietest form of violence, the final, most calculated blow: silent contempt. When ridicule, confusion, and invalidation have eroded your defenses, they do not raise their voice, they disappear. With surgical coldness, they withdraw their presence, their acknowledgement, their gaze, not in anger, but with indifference. And that absence speaks louder than any scream. It tells you, you are nothing. This is not a fight, it's erasure. You stand there, emotionally naked, the soul screaming for recognition, for human contact, for some trace of acknowledgement, and what do you receive? A void, a deliberate lack of response, a silence that wounds more deeply than any insult because it starves the psyche of what it needs most: connection, mirroring, affirmation of existence. Carl Jung understood that the greatest suffering often comes not from trauma that erupts, but from wounds that are never named. What you deny subjugates you, what you accept transforms you. And when someone withholds their presence as punishment, they are not just rejecting you, they are triggering your most primal fear: annihilation of the self. The child within you, who once cried out for love, attention, or safety and was met with coldness, rises again. The body remembers. The silence becomes symbolic. It tells your nervous system, you are unworthy of response. You do not matter enough to be addressed. And so you shrink. You tiptoe around invisible walls. You second-guess every word. You hold your breath, waiting for validation that never arrives. Until one day, you no longer recognize your own voice. You stop expressing, stop trusting, stop feeling. Not because you are healed, but because your soul has armored itself against further harm. This form of psychic abandonment is not always easy to name, but its consequences are devastating, because to be ignored is to be symbolically annihilated, and when you tolerate this enough times, it doesn't just hurt, it reprograms you. You become conditioned to betray your own reality just to stay in someone else's orbit. And this is the point where many break, not with a scream, but with a silence of their own, a silence that marks not peace, but the quiet death of authenticity. Jung's warning echoes with renewed clarity. That which you do not confront rules over you. That which you refuse to name grows in shadow and steals your light. If you're enduring this, know it is not love, it is not care, it is not your fault. It is a psychic act of negation. And you do not have to disappear to be loved. You do not have to vanish to deserve peace, but we have not yet reached the deepest wound. Two more behaviors remain, and they are the most insidious, the most corrosive to the soul. These do not simply harm you, they transform you. They reach into the very architecture of your being and, if left unchecked, they do not just leave scars. They remake your identity in their image. So I ask you now, do you wish to continue? Because what comes next is not only a violation, it is a possession. So far we have spoken of the outer forces that mold you, bend you, and distort the shape of your perception. But what follows is not merely done to you. It is what begins to awaken within you when you have been wounded long enough. It is not just aggression, it is contagion. And once internalized, it slips into your decisions, your gestures, your silences. You become what hurt you. The sixth behavior is this: the normalization of sacrifice as virtue. And it is perhaps the most dangerous of all because it is the most celebrated. The world wraps it in ribbons and calls it love. You are taught since childhood that disappearing for others is noble, that love means erasing yourself, that peace is achieved by quieting your needs, that martyrdom is maturity, and so, without even noticing, you began to vanish. You placed yourself last in your own story, thinking that one day your turn would come, but it never did. Here lies the cruel paradox. Not everything you do in the name of love is sacred. Not everything you call patience is peace. Not everything you endure is growth. Sometimes what you call sacrifice is simply fear wearing a halo. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of not being enough unless you give it all away. Fear that if you assert yourself, you will lose love altogether. And so you forget your own center. You silence your joy, your needs, your instinctual boundaries. You become a ghost that serves others at the cost of your own becoming. Carl Jung warned of this betrayal of the self, the true, central organizing principle of the psyche. He saw clearly that anything which alienates you from your center fragments your wholeness. It splits your soul into pieces, one part always giving, another always grieving. And here is the tragedy. Society applauds this disintegration. You are praised for being agreeable, for making no demands, for showing up for everyone except yourself. But no one asks, when will you show up for you? When will your own needs matter enough to be honored? This is not generosity. It is not virtue. It is self-abandonment masked as care. And the most dangerous thing is this. If sacrifice becomes your identity, you lose your reflection. You can no longer see who you are without the suffering. And then, how do you return to yourself? Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that cannot happen if you are living someone else's script. To reclaim yourself is not selfish. It is sacred. It is the beginning of your return. And you are allowed to begin now." And what becomes of a soul that has silenced its truth for too long? What happens when a person no longer remembers the sound of their own voice? When their inner compass has been shattered and their boundaries dissolved like mist? This is the final wound. The seventh and most devastating behavior, the acceptance of contempt as the price for belonging. It is the place where the self no longer resists, where the inner fire has been dimmed by so many wounds. Covert manipulation, veiled humiliation, eroded perception, emotional invalidation, calculated silence, and the chronic denial of one's own needs, that one begins to believe that even mistreatment is better than solitude. This is not surrender, this is psychic resignation, and it is here, in this abyss, that Carl Jung spoke of psychic death, the severing of the individual from the self, the collapse of the inner architecture that once gave meaning, voice, and dignity. You stop asking, you stop hoping, you begin to believe that crumbs are a feast. You tell yourself the lie that has devoured countless souls, "I deserve this." You normalize rejection, you dress wounds with excuses, you justify what once would have broken you. And the tragedy is not that others failed you. The tragedy is that you began to fail yourself. Jung understood this with piercing clarity. He saw that when one detaches from the self, when the ego becomes too weak to hold its center, the person begins to fragment. This is not a metaphor. This is psychological disintegration. And in that fragmentation, a terrible illusion takes root. That belonging, any belonging, even to those who diminish you, is preferable to facing the void alone. That the silence of contempt is better than the silence of solitude. But it is not. Listen carefully. Nothing is worth the slow erosion of your soul. Yes, loneliness is heavy, but living in the shadows of people who drain you is not connection, it is spiritual exile. You were not born to be tolerated. You were not made to disappear for others to shine. You are not here to beg for scraps of affection or acceptance. You are here to return to yourself, to the sacred center within that remembers who you were before the world taught you to shrink. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but in that terror lies your freedom. Because when you accept yourself fully and without apology, you will no longer settle for a life that asks you to vanish to be loved." So if you've allowed these behaviors, if you have tolerated what your soul has quietly wept over, know this: you can choose again. You can stop. You can speak. You can return. The door back to yourself has never been locked. You simply forgot it was yours to open. And if you've arrived here, fully, inwardly, you already know. Not just in your mind, but in your body, in the ache behind your eyes, in the silence you've endured for far too long. Every word has touched a bruise, perhaps not all at once, Perhaps not every behavior, but enough to make your soul stir with the weight of recognition. You know what it means to shrink so others can feel tall. You know the quiet violence of smiling while your spirit contracts. You've walked through rooms where your presence was muted, where your essence was diluted just to preserve peace. And now, you know. You can no longer claim ignorance. These 7 behaviors, 7 psychic poisons, have lived in your story, tolerated by the parts of you that feared rejection more than erasure. Jung never catalogued these wounds for comfort. He offered them like warning bells in a fog, a voice from the unconscious saying, "Wake up, reclaim yourself, before you vanish completely." And now the most difficult truth emerges. Many will nod in agreement, feel the sting of clarity, and change nothing. They'll return to the familiar ache, to the same dynamic, to the slow betrayal of the self. Not because they're weak, but because comfort seduces more than truth. Because facing the void of becoming authentic feels, at first, like dying. But if you've read this far, if something within you is rising like heat through the chest, you are not asleep anymore. Something deeper is stirring, a sacred defiance, a voice that whispers, "No more." Maybe you don't yet know the steps. Maybe you still tremble. That's fine. Because fire doesn't begin with a blaze. It begins with a single spark that refuses to go out. And this is where the real alchemy begins. Not in blaming others, not in playing the role of the eternal victim, but in radical self-honesty. Where have you allowed the unacceptable? Whom have you excused for too long? What fragments of your soul have you bartered for approval? Jung never offered bandages. He offered mirrors, not the kind that flatter, but the kind that confront. If this reflection feels unbearable, it is not because it's false. It's because you are finally seeing what you buried to survive. And hear this closely. If you choose to change, if you dare to withdraw consent from what wounds you, prepare for loss. You will shed illusions, people will leave, habits will collapse. But don't be deceived. You are not losing anything that ever truly belonged. You are releasing what was quietly taking your life. Every loss will be a liberation, every ending a reclamation. What remains will be real, yours, unshakable, what cannot be broken unless you offer the key. Jung never wrote for applause. He wrote to awaken the sleeping gods within you. And today, one of them has opened its eyes. Do not lull it back to sleep. Do not unsee what you have seen. Do not betray the self just to feel safe. Because here lies the hidden truth, the one no one tells you, but your soul has always known. True power is not in being respected by the world. True power is in no longer needing it. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home, or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember. Real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here, in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this video, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this, when the right person appears, your soul will know, not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, Let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation, that is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.